Thank you for joining for this episode of the TechSpective Podcast. I have with me my good friend Anthony Freed. So Anthony, welcome. If you want to share a little bit about yourself.
Tony, always good to see you. Thanks for having me on. I'm the Director of Research Communications for Halcyon. We've got a focus on ransomware and been in this business for a long time, known you for a long time, formerly at a few other vendors. Before that, did some security journalism and started out on the finance side, actually, is what got me interested in security almost 20 years ago.
Okay. Yeah, it's like it really ages us when we talk about, we've known each other for 20 years. Yeah. So, you and I, we worked together at Cybereason, and obviously we had a big ransomware focus there, is like all we talked about. But at that time, 3-4 years ago, it was just, we went from ransomware to double extortion and triple extortion, and the focus was still primarily on just cybercriminal threat groups or whatever. Obviously, ransomware has continued to evolve since then, both in the tactics and in just the broader sense. And it seems like it's gone from being just a tool of financially motivated cybercriminals to being kind of this growing trend of attacks on critical infrastructure or attacks that have a kind of a geopolitical nation-state adversary undercurrent. So what do you talk to me about that and what you see as kind of the key indicators of that shift?
Well, I mean, let's just go back a little bit. And, one of the things I find kind of interesting about the times we're in right now, with this rise of ransomware-as-a-service and this very, it's a specialized ransomware economy. You've got, initial access brokers, you've got the RAS platform providers, you've got their affiliate attackers, you've got money launderers, and these RAS platforms are set up with, they do recruiting for, new coders. They have an HR function. They have IT help desks to help both the attackers and sometimes the victims, get through the process of being encrypted and ransomed and then hopefully unencrypted again. Although you and I have worked on a couple of reports where we know that's not always the case, right? You pay a ransom and you don't necessarily get your data back, or it's corrupted, or they've exfiltrated the data, which is a huge problem right now. And it's not like they're sending you back the files, right? So even if you paid, that data could still be out there. So you're talking about, potential loss of intellectual property. If you're an organization that handles regulated data, you're looking at, besides the cost of the incident response and whatever you might have paid for a ransom, now potentially you're going to be subject to lawsuits from investors, or if you're handling personal data from those that were exposed. I mean, this is a big problem. You don't see, if you're an organization that's been successfully attacked with ransomware, you're not going to see that whole incident really close out for a couple of years. The potential liabilities just drag on. So that being said, if we go back, say 10, 15 years ago, everybody, their hair was on fire about APTs, right? Nation state sponsored attackers, very sophisticated, getting in, again, stealing intellectual property or conducting espionage against our government and allied governments. And you saw everybody rushing out to buy, the latest security solutions to protect against this, right? Even if they were organizations that were not in the defense industrial base or otherwise, let's say, of interest to a nation like Russia or China, but they were buying based on this fear, right? Now today, we're in the middle of this kind of ransomware epidemic where everybody from the biggest corporations that you see in the headlines all the time having been attacked to small mom and pop shops are getting hit as well. And there doesn't seem to be that same level of, oh my God, this is really serious. We've got to do a solution to this. It's kind of, I don't know. Part of it could also be that people are just getting a little bit immune to all these breaches, all these attacks. 15 years ago, hacker was just kind of coming into the common vernacular. The term, cyber was just, even our industry was kind of settling on, we're going to call it cyber security, and all this stuff was very new. But now, this stuff has been well publicized for a while. It's made it into movies and stuff. People might just also be getting a little immune to it. That being said, the models that we saw with APT operations was already clearly established that some of these attackers were either moonlighting for the Russian government. So that was a very successful model, right? With the attackers outdoing their own cybercrime kind of stuff, making a buck, also working for some of these rogue governments who give them safe harbor. What makes us think that they would have abandoned that kind of relationship just because the focus has kind of moved more towards these ransomware operations, right? You look at a ransomware attack where there's data exfiltration, there's really nothing different about it from an espionage operation other than at the very end, a ransomware payload is dropped, right? That's the big difference. So really, this is just kind of an evolution of what's already been happening. And we see that same kind of model where there's threat actors who might be conducting some attacks because it's financially motivated. They're making a buck off of it. The country that they live in is never going to let them, get extradited to face any kind of indictments overseas. And so they continue to do that. And I think you're seeing a lot more of some of these attacks. A subset are also potentially being influenced or even directed directly by governments like Russia and China, right, because they serve a geopolitical means. Now, what kinds of attacks would that be? Well, maybe not the one that, on a mom and pop shop, but definitely one that's going to interrupt supply chain, this spate of attacks against healthcare, as you mentioned before, critical infrastructure. These attacks, they still get to make some money off of them, right? But they also kind of play into the larger geopolitical aspirations of, people like Putin.
Right. Well, and yeah, I mean, I've read a bunch of stuff on Russia, on China. I read The Long Game. I read Dmitry Alperovich's book. And so and with Russia in particular, it seems like there's a very well documented history of yes, there are certain specific goals that they have in mind, but Russia seems intent on just causing chaos. Like they're not, a lot of times they're not even trying to pick a winner in the debate. They're putting misinformation and disinformation on both sides of the fence because they're just trying to create chaos. They're just trying to undermine trust. They're just trying to, weaken, Western democracy. So to that end, yes, it's great if they could make a few bucks, take their cut off the top of whatever the ransom is by allowing the ransomware operators to function within within the country, but also they get the added benefit of just creating a lack of confidence that our healthcare system will be up and running and that our water will be safe and everything else.
They're trying to undermine trust in these institutions and these systems that we've grown accustomed to working for us. And, go back to what I said about, an APT espionage operation looks just like a ransomware operation until that ransomware payload drops, right? So what kind of flabbergasts me the way we're addressing this, because right now our only avenue that we know of that's being discussed publicly anyway. I'd assume there's other things that we're obviously not privy to in the intelligence community and whatnot, but our stated responses have all been through the Department of Justice, right? Long investigations,
right?
2 years, and we indict 3 people who will never enjoy safe harbor, so they're never going to get extradited to face it. And this is just not an effective way to combat, this level of and this volume of attacks whatsoever. So it just kind of flabbergasts me that we think, oh, look at this. We can see this operation within this company or within an agency of the government, and it's, it must be an espionage operation, right? Oh, no, there's a ransomware payload. I guess it's not. We're going to slide it over to the DOJ. We're going to just address it through law enforcement.
Right.
And just because there's a ransomware payload there. But what we're doing is we're creating this opportunity for governments like Russia and China to have plausible deniability, right? Like, no. And look at, okay, critical infrastructure, Typhoon, all the Typhoon attacks that have been attributed to China. We had a FBI director Ray out there naming China as the culprit behind it. China's response was, oh no, that wasn't us. That was a ransomware operator, right? Well, how do they get to say that? Well, because just drop a ransomware payload at the end of the operation, and then it's all done, right? You can just wash your hands of it, and you're off the hook.
Never mind that.
And that seems ridiculous.
I'm not in the intelligence community, but my understanding of, sort of the geopolitical dynamics in Russia and in China is there's basically no such thing as an independent, cybercriminal organization. Like if the country is allowing you to function as a cybercriminal organization, it is with their sanctioned approval. It's like, assuming that China, there's, and basically my assumption, and again, I don't know this, my assumption is that there are not rogue cybercrime gangs operating out of Russia or China that Russia and China don't control. And if there were, they would put an end to that very quickly.
I mean, it's Evil Corp, works in conjunction with the FSB. China, WinNTI, one of the oldest threat actors, a very, very diverse set of targets. They do everything from, industrial espionage, corporate espionage, government espionage, to, spying and suppressing dissident groups like the Uyghurs or, the protesters around Hong Kong. I mean, these guys have such a wide array of targets that they do. It's and so much of it is absolutely to the benefit of the Chinese government or to the Russian government that it's undeniable. But yet we still sit around and talk about these attacks as just being financially motivated ransomware attacks. And I think we need to escalate this conversation. We need to look at taking a subset of these attacks and treating them more seriously as a national security crisis, right? Now, in order to do that, we've got to have some serious conversations about what the government's role is in defending organizations, private organizations, from these actors. And so as soon as we start saying, well, maybe some of these are influenced or supported or even directed or conducted by nation state operators, then we open a whole can of worms. And for some reason, it seems like we're trying to avoid that. And we've always kind of been trying to avoid that with cyber, right? Not to let it escalate and cross over into, let's say, kinetic kind of responses or that kind of potential. We've always underplayed, just how much we're attacked and how seriously we're attacked. But I think, there's research out now that shows definitively that you can't necessarily point to a person and say this person died because of a ransomware attack, but the data shows that ransomware attacks on healthcare organizations, on a hospital, increase the mortality rate of hospitalized Medicaid or Medicare patients, right? Because there's only limited sets of data that we can really get.
Yeah.
Refined kind of results. So, but it increased it by like 35%. So that's an extra 1 in 3 people who are hospitalized, who are on Medicare, who are dying because of delayed care, interruptions, inability to access their medical files, delayed surgeries, right? Diverted ambulances. This is really, really serious. So I was glad last year to see that the Senate Intelligence Committee had introduced a bill where they were going to elevate some ransomware attacks to the level of terrorism. as far as our ability and mechanisms to respond. The problem is what they were doing is, oh, we're going to name these 10 groups as ransomware operators as being, ones that we're going to designate as like terrorist organizations, right? Well, the problem is we don't know who those people are behind it, and we don't even know how to talk about this really, right? So when we say Lockbit, are you talking about the RAS provider, right? Okay, that's Lockbit, the people who develop the platform and the payloads that you can go rent to do your attacks. Or are we talking about the affiliate attackers who are using that platform, but they're not necessarily the developers of it? Are they Lockbit? No, as we saw with MGM, it was Scattered Spider using Black Cat Alpha V platform, right? But Scattered Spider.
Right.
So and then Lockbit 4 is coming out now, the version 4. So, are we talking about the payload?
Well, also, if you start off by saying,
talking about the affiliates.
If you start off by saying, hey, we're going to name these 10, these groups change their names all the time. They dissolve and reform. So now you just rebrand yourself and you're like, cool, I'm no longer on the terrorist watch list.
It could be some of the same people behind these groups, right? We have no idea. So I think that's kind of a short-sighted way to do it. And then we got to introduce new legislation when a new group spins up. And follow the report I do quarterly. These groups spin up and spin down all the time, right? So that's not I think the approach. The approach will be, say, the targets, right? If you hit healthcare providers, if you hit other critical infrastructure providers, utilities, water treatment plants, like that. If you hit defense industrial-based targets, if you hit government, municipalities, states, then we're going to call these whatever we decide to call them: national security threats, state-sponsored terrorism, whatever. That's not for me to worry about how they decide to drop nomenclature on us.
But as you pointed out, it's been a challenge for at least a decade, actually more than a decade, of trying to define, okay, well, what is the response? And I'm like most of the way through Teresa Payton's book, Manipulated, and somewhere in the beginning, she does address that, like certain attacks, like the, North Korea attack against Sony or whatever. It's like, if North Korea had dropped paratroopers into the Sony parking lot and they walked into the Sony building and took this data, that would be an act of war and we would respond accordingly. But because they did it digitally, we just kind of go, what are you going to do?
Well, that's what I'm saying, where we're trying not to let cyber escalate to the point of where it's, this same level of national security concern as, say, a naval blockade or, some other, military kind of action and stuff. And I can understand we don't want to escalate things, but we can't deny that we've been in basically a cyber cold war for a couple of decades now, and it's escalating. And they found a better model for that plausible deniability to just say it wasn't us, and that's the ransomware game.
Right. Well, and I do also I think it's sometimes overstated or exaggerated, but I do respect that attribution is difficult. And so if you set up a system where you say, hey, we are allowed to, we're allowed to launch Tomahawk missiles at you if there's a cyber attack. It's like, well, you better be damn sure you know what country that cyber attack came from before you start launching Tomahawks.
Well, my comeback to that is, and I'm quoting friends who've worked in the intelligence community, NSA and stuff, who are in the security industry now and stuff, as saying, I say attribution is hard, and they go, well, attribution is hard for us. It's not as hard for our intelligence community. It's not as hard for the NSA, because they have the benefit of not just cyber, but also signals intelligence, human, all these other factors that come together to form much more complete picture than we would ever see from, pouring through logs and trying to piece together who the attacker might be. So,
okay. I guess, I'd be curious, you've addressed some of these things, but like, what are your thoughts on how to improve that? How do we, like there's definitely been progress, but how do we continue to improve the public sector, private sector cooperation on these things? How do we define the line? Because where previously, and this even goes through Sony, there was still a line of them saying, well, no, that's a private sector, we don't get involved. That's a private sector company. And it's like, yeah, that line's blurred though. Like everyone is a nation state, possible nation state victim. And so the government can't just wash their hands and say, well, no, if you're a private company, we're not helping you. In the same way that the United States government doesn't require me to provide my own air defense over my house, the U.S. government shouldn't, require every company in the United States to provide their own cyber defense. Like somebody has to kind of protect the nation as a whole.
But we've largely been left to fend for ourselves, right? I mean, the biggest reason, now the government has definitely done things, the establishment of CISA, some of the programs that CISA's done, and making more of information available, like, say, the top exploited vulnerabilities that ransomware operators are using, the top tool sets that they're using, the common IOCs and stuff. And this is all valuable information that, you as a defender can use to protect your organization. But in the end, basically, all the government has to offer us at this point is, guidelines and frameworks, right? Maybe a poster for your lunchroom, right? I just don't think that level of response rises to the level of this threat. This threat is very, very serious, as we've seen when these ransomware operators have, let's say, potentially overstepped their bounds accidentally, an attack, let's say, like you saw with Colonial Pipeline, right? I think the consensus is they probably didn't mean to cause that big of a disruption. They certainly didn't mean to end up, having the U.S. president mentioning Putin ransomware and Colonial Pipeline attack all in a press conference and stuff. And what we saw very shortly after that was dark side was shut down, right, by the Russians. So there's definitely, they're definitely getting swatted down if they overstep. But for the most part, we're not stepping up. We're not public or private. We're not stepping up and doing what we need to do to be able to defend against these kinds of attacks. And just think if they decided that they did want to cause as much chaos as they could. Right now, I think it's just very, very, they're taking jabs. They're spoken about before in some of our institutions, but for the most part, we don't have a game plan. I think the government just doesn't know how to respond to this, and that's a little scary.
True. Well, and one of the other aspects, though, has always been, we have many allies around the world, or we did up until a couple weeks ago. But we have allies around the world who we do have extradition treaties with. We can work with them cooperatively. But if you're operating out of China, if you're operating out of Russia, even if I know exactly who you are and I know exactly where you live, there's nothing I can do about it. So it's like, which kind of comes back to creating laws isn't helping us. Like having another law that says, well, if you do that, there's going to be a harsher penalty. It's like, only if we catch you. I read Andy Greenberg's Tracers in the Dark. It's like, they did all this like legwork to identify this guy, and it took years because they just had to wait patiently for him to be dumb enough to leave the country on vacation. Like they knew who he was, they knew they wanted to arrest him, but they couldn't do anything until he went to Greece, and then they're like, aha, gotcha.
Well, I mean, at some point, I think, and we're probably well past that point. We've got to draw a line in the sand, and we've got to, designate a subset of ransomware attacks as being national security issues, and we've got to put forth a menu of items that could be potential responses should you cross that line. And that's the only way we're going to really get deterrence. I mean, the idea is like, oh, let's ban ransomware payments. I mean, that could be catastrophic to organizations. I mean, do you really want to be a CEO sitting there telling your shareholders, well, we can turn shit back on, but we can't pay this ransom. So I guess our hospital systems are going to continue to be frozen until we go re-image 10,000 endpoints or something.
Well, and I also, I don't know how, actually, you would be the person to speak to this. I don't know how prevalent this has gotten, but I remember a few years ago, it was like around November, December, I think of 22, there was an attack where it was a ransomware attack, but there was no encryption. They just did the data exfiltration part. And I remember thinking at the time, that's kind of brilliant, because if I encrypt your systems, if I attack you as a hospital system and I encrypt things and I take your hospital offline, that draws attention. It creates headlines. It brings attention that maybe you don't want. And the thing is, a lot of companies, there's a stigma around paying the ransom, as there should be. Like you definitely shouldn't just pay the ransom unless you have to. But if I only steal your data and there's nothing, I didn't shut you down. Well, now we can just kind of keep it between us, just between friends, so we can negotiate the ransom. Nobody else needs to know that I'm paying the ransom.
Yeah, as long as it wasn't, regulated data where they're obligated to, report to an agency. So I think Beyond Leon was one of the first threat actors to kind of abandon their payload, and they're still going strong. Put them in about the middle of the pack as far as the volume of attacks and stuff. But their source code got leaked, and they were like, "Oh, should we retool or just go with data extortion attacks?" And they've been pretty, successful with that. I don't really have any insight as to how that affected their bottom line, whether or not that meant they were also willing to take, less in ransom demands than they had prior when they were dropping the encryption protocol during the attack. So I don't know, but I can say, it's definitely attackers have ROI to think about, and not having to maintain and retool when your source code is leaked and stuff like that is saving them money. But it definitely means that they don't have as much leverage when they're in that negotiation, right? And then also to your point about kind of, whether or not we're seeing everything that we should be able to see as far as there's no source of truth on ransomware attacks, right? There's no place you can go and really understand how many attacks, how many ransoms paid, how many organizations were able to recover their data with or without having paid a ransom stuff. You get sporadic reports here and there that kind of shine a little light in one area or another. A lot of them are one-off reports that are never repeated again, so you can't get those deltas month over month or year over year. And then you harken back to like the federal government had infiltrated ransomware organization's infrastructure and monitored them for some time. This is an older group. It's kind of not been defunct for a few years now, but the FBI basically estimated that based on what they were seeing as far as their attacking, that only about 20% of the attacks were getting reported to the authorities. So if we just based off that number, everything you're seeing out there, you can at least 5x, so that's a huge problem. Chainalysis, who does excellent work tracking the ransomware payments through cryptocurrency, they were able to establish that last year, over $1 billion was paid out. And that's not even other means that these attackers have to monetize, say, that exfiltrated data, right? Just because they said, okay, you paid potentially one ransom or a second ransom demand just to assure the security of the data, there's no guarantee that they're not monetizing that and selling off parts of it on the black market and stuff. It's just once your data's out the door, that's it.
Right. I mean, that's always been on my mind when it comes to the data exfiltration part, where it's like, well, you need to pay us so we don't steal, so we don't leak or sell your data. It's like, okay, so now I've paid you. I have zero way to verify that you don't still have my data. There's literally no way for you to prove that. And so I would assume that in a lot of cases they still do. And going back to the beginning of this conversation, with the ties, the geopolitical ties to, nation states like Russia and China, with those relationships between the cybercrime groups in those countries and the governments, I would think if I was Putin, if I was Xi, I'd be like, listen, just whatever data you get, just give it to us. We'll be the stewards of the data.
That's kind of how they always operated, even before this ransomware phase. I mean, it was kind of like you're in Russia, you're doing some cybercrime on the side, and the deal is you get to keep doing that. But if you run across anything that is potentially of interest to the Russian government, you definitely have to share it, right? And then we also saw at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, there was a huge drop off in the number of ransomware attacks. Right, there's this big lull, which a lot of people have assessed to be some of these threat actors being pulled off to do other things, maybe around attacking Ukraine's infrastructure or whatnot, or the Western governments that UK has been getting hammered. Russia's really got it out for them right now because of their support for Ukraine and stuff. But then the ransomware economy kind of bounced back. And then, as we were chatting about through before the show, and a couple of notes that I gave you, was a really interesting case is the ransomware attack against Stoli, right?
Mm-hmm.
The vodka maker. Okay. So Stoli has been a target for Putin for almost 25 years now, since the early 2000s. Basically, in a nutshell, Stoli kind of, shut down a lot of operations in Russia, moved them to Europe. Basically, have been resisting efforts by the Russian government to reclaim that brand. And so then just late last year, there was an attack against Stoli US, caused them to have to file bankruptcy, pretty serious attack and damages and stuff. And it's just I can't see that as just being a coincidence that a ransomware gang happened to just target Stoli. I mean, there's lots of companies getting attacked, but that it didn't have some kind of tie-in with this ongoing kind of persecution that Putin's been trying to do of that company, right?
Right.
I think those two instances, the dip at the beginning of the Ukraine war, the attack against Stoli, and then if you look at another report out from Chainalysis about 2024, is that the number of attacks were up, but the number of ransoms paid was down, and the potential causes for those and stuff. And so if you get a little bit speculative, you'll see in the report, it was toward the end of 2024 that there was the most precipitous decline. That also kind of corresponds with the time period of the U.S. election. So again, you could see there's a potential to assess that maybe some of those attacker resources were pulled off of their cybercrime activities and geared a little bit more towards geopolitical operations.
Right.
Again, speculative, but you start taking all these little bits of evidence, putting them together, and it's like it's pretty clear that these ransomware operators are in to one degree or another working in cahoots with these governments, adversarial governments.
Right. Well, that we're kind of winding down. We've managed to make it not political, but I was going to say that now that our nation's government is effectively a Russian asset, will we see a decline in ransomware attacks from Russia against the United States?
There's a lot to unpack there. I think we'll have to wait a little bit longer.
I don't need you to go on record with that. I just when you look at Tulsi Gabbard, and there's a lot of people with a lot of Russian connections. And so I'd be curious to kind of monitor that over the next few years and see now that we're close allies, maybe we get fewer ransomware attacks.
I will offer this personally, not as a representative of the organization I work for, but that I think what we've witnessed here in this last 30, 40 years is one of the most successful information warfare campaigns ever conducted by Russia, and then especially since Putin has been in power, because he's former KGB and he's a really smart guy. And we've seen this with the advent of the internet, that these information warfare campaigns have really accelerated, right? It's a really powerful tool, and I think they've been super successful at it.
Yeah.
I'll leave it with that.
Well, I was going to say I agree with you, and I'm actually I'm going to have Teresa on the podcast soon. So I'm coordinating with her to have her on the podcast.
She's really fun.
Well, and part of the reason I wanted to have her on is here's one of the things I find frustrating, and I don't want to drag this into a whole. We could be a whole separate podcast. But one of the things I find frustrating is I read Manipulated. I've read a lot of books about Russian espionage, U.S. espionage, Chinese espionage, and the thing is, like, we've known these things. Like we know that Putin has been doing these things. We know that they have these bot farms out of St. Petersburg, and so we know all of those things. And it's like, okay, well, if we know all of those things, and we've documented all of these tactics, and we've got these brilliant, high-tech intelligence agencies, why are we where we are? How did we let that happen? It's like me knowing that you're going to throw. It's like me knowing that you're going to throw a pass. Like if you're watching the Super Bowl last night or whatever. It's like I know for a fact you're going to throw a pass to the left side of the field, and then I just don't defend it.
So yeah, I don't have a good answer for you on that. Like I said, I assume there's a lot going on behind the scenes that we're not privy to, but I haven't seen that manifest in making U.S. organizations more secure against these kinds of attacks.
Yeah,
I just haven't seen it.
Well, I guess you'll have to tune back in. I'm sure it'll be, regardless of how it goes, I'm sure it'll be a great conversation with Teresa. Yeah, thank you for taking the time to join me.
Tony, thank you for having me.
I appreciate you investing your time to listen to the podcast, but I also invite you to engage on social media. Please go like our Facebook page and follow at TechSpective on Twitter and Instagram. You can feel free to let me know what you like, let me know what you don't like, let me know if you love it, let me know if it sucks, and let me know what products you'd like to see reviewed or what questions you'd like to see answered in future posts.